Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman, and this is Western Civilization. Now, aside from the normal readings and the primary sources dealing specifically with European history and the rise of the West in world civilization, these lectures are going to be focusing a little bit on the subject of world civilization and the world history. And what we'll try to do during the course is try to figure out where Europe fits in to this grand scheme. So these lectures will cover several different topics in several different time periods. And like I said, we'll try to figure out where the West falls in this scheme. Now, this course presents some of the highlights of the world historical approach to the past, suggesting major changes in the framework of the human experience, from the rise of agriculture to the present day. The lectures cover the emergence of distinct major societies as they deal with common problems, but generate quite different institutional and cultural approaches. The course also discusses key changes in belief systems, the emergence and spread of the great world religions, for example, as well as alterations in trading patterns and basic shifts in technology. Now, exploring why some societies reacted differently to technological change than others. Throughout the course, we will look at many parts of the world in these lectures, including those clustered into shared civilizations. East Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean loom large from the start. Sub-Saharan Africa, where the human species originated, has also played a great role in world history, as ultimately has Northern Europe, including Russia. The Americas offer an important variant until their incorporation in global patterns from 1492 onward. Now, Central Asia maintained a distinct position in world history until the 16th century. Now, global history divides into a limited number of time periods, defined in terms of dominant themes. The rise of agriculture requires a discussion of pre-agricultural patterns. Following agriculture came in several places the advent of civilization as a form of human organization. Now, this classical period in world history draws attention to China, India, Persia, and for the emphasis on this course, the Mediterranean, when the expansion and integration of these large societies dominated over a millennium of human history. The collapse of the classical empires ushered in a vital post-classical period, when emphasis shifted to religion, but also to more ambitious patterns of interregional trade. It was in this post-classical period that ran from about 500 to 1500 CE that the emphasis of major societies shifted from separate development to greater interaction and even deliberate imitation. The early modern period highlights renewed capacity for empire, the inclusion of the Americas in global systems, and though this must be handled with a bit of care, the rise of Western Europe. Now, what some historians call the long 19th century, from 1750 to 1914, was dominated by Western industrialization and its economic, military, and cultural impact on literally the entire world. Finally, the contemporary period in world history, after World War I, features a bewildering variety of themes that must be sorted out, with emphasis, among other things, on the relative decline of the West, the huge surge in human population, and the potential for greater globalization. Now, world history highlights a number of major regions, but it avoids simply examining one area after another. If it's Tuesday, this must be Latin America. By making careful comparisons and focusing on interregional contacts, the discipline emphasizes a number of key time periods, though not an indefinite number, defined in terms of basic changes in the ways many societies operated, whether the change was in an economic system, industrialization, for example, or a cultural system, as seen, for example, in the emergence of vigorous missionary religions. World history also embraces two common themes. First and most obviously is the eternal tension between change and continuity, the stuff of history as a discipline. Particularly once the classical traditions are defined, world history can be seen in terms of new forces being met and interpreted by established cultural and institutional systems. Now, of course, these systems change, but never completely and never in exactly the same ways from one society to the next. The second theme involves a perpetual interplay between local or regional identities, on the one hand, and the attraction or simple inevitability of wider contacts on the other. Societies began trading at long distances several millennia ago. They received immigrants and diseases and sometimes ideas from distant places, but they rarely, at least willingly, simply surrendered to outside influence. And sometimes they battled fiercely against such influence in the name of established values. Now, over time, of course, and particularly with contemporary globalization, the pendulum shifted toward more outside influence, either willingly embraced or endured of necessity. But the tension has not ended, and assertions of regional identities can intensify precisely because the external framework is so intrusive. World history allows us to trace the main iterations of this tension and to place its current iteration in context, and even tentatively to talk about the future. Now, in this course, as I mentioned earlier, we will not be focusing on world history, but rather the rise of Western civilization. So particularly, we'll be looking at two of these time periods I've already mentioned. The classical period, which includes the civilizations of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and the post-classical period, which in Western Europe we'll refer to as the Middle Ages, or the medieval period, that runs up from the fall of Rome up to the Renaissance. So let's take a look at some of the things that happened prior to this time period in Western civilization and in world civilization itself. And in this section of the lecture, we're going to talk about the Neolithic Revolution. Now, the rise of agriculture was one of the great changes in the human experience. Many important developments occurred before this, yet the emergence of agriculture was neither tidy nor uniform, and this messiness must be taken into account when studying this period. The fact is that agriculture greatly changed the nature of life for most people around the world. Further, much of what we deal with in world history involves societies that were primarily agricultural. Indeed, the world is still grappling with the legacies of agricultural patterns and the incomplete transition between agricultural and more urban and industrial ways of life. Now, agriculture began around 9000 BCE. And I use this term BCE, which is equivalent to the term BC, before Christ, but BCE refers more specifically before the Common Era. And then after the death of Christ, or Anno Domini AD, I will be using the abbreviation CE. Now, between the emergence of humans about 2.5 million years ago until about 11,000 years ago, our species was involved in hunting and gathering. Now, this long period between the emergence of our species and the rise of agriculture raises three important points. Between 2.5 million years ago and about 100,000 years ago, the human species went through a variety of evolutionary phases in different parts of the world. Now, early versions of human species originated in East Africa and migrated to different parts of the world. Homo sapiens sapiens emerged about 120,000 years ago, and from that point onward, there have been no major evolutionary changes in the human experience. The human species, even before Homo sapiens sapiens, which by the way means wise man, was a tool-using animal more adept than other species at finding tools for hunting, gathering, or use as weapons. During the Mesolithic era, around 12,000 BCE, and the Neolithic era, about 8,000 BCE, tool use, and by extension domestication of some animals, became increasingly deliberate, setting a framework for the emergence of agriculture itself. Now, massive migration is particularly vital to global history. Some thousands of years after the species originated in East Africa, Homo sapiens sapiens began to pour out into other regions and ultimately around the world. The reason for this migration is simply that hunter-gatherer societies require as much as 2.5 square miles of space per person. By 25,000 BCE, Homo sapiens sapiens occurred virtually every place on the world that is currently inhabited, except New Zealand and some other Pacific islands and Bermuda. Now, human history begins at a point when the species was widely dispersed. As noted in the textbook, one of the key tensions in world history is the balance between the local and the connected. People were initially spread out in small numbers, and inevitably, because of environmental conditions and other factors, formed intensely local cultures and institutions, setting the stage for the current regional aspect of human identity. About 12,000 years ago, roughly 10 to 9,000 BCE, there were at most 5 to 10 million people in the world. Agriculture was introduced into this framework. Homo sapiens coexisted with other human species, such as the Neanderthals, for a long time, and it is not known how Homo sapiens triumphed over other species, but the process served to illustrate the complexity of the developments that prefigured agriculture. Let us now turn to the question of when agriculture was introduced, the complexities of its introduction, and its implications for the future. The introduction of agriculture, sometimes called the Neolithic Revolution, was a crucial change in the human experience. Some would argue that, other than the emergence of the species itself, the development of agriculture and the later replacement of agricultural economies with industrial economies are the two key developments of the human experience. Agriculture was invented in at least three separate places. The first invention occurred in the northern Middle East, Black Sea region, with domestication of wheat and barley, which is the region that we will be focusing on in Western civilization. The second invention occurred in South China and continental Southeast Asia around 7000 BCE with the introduction of rice. The third invention was the domestication of corn, or maize, in Central America about 5000 BCE. And agriculture may also have been invented in other places, including sub-Saharan Africa and northern China. By 5000 BCE, agriculture had gradually spread and was becoming the most common economic system for the largest number of people in the world. Despite the advantages over hunting and gathering, its widespread adoption was very slow. One reason for this slow spread was that contacts among relatively far-flung populations were minimal. Not all regions were suitable for agriculture. Some were heavily forested or arid. An alternative economic system based on nomadic herding of animals prevailed for a long time over agriculture in the Middle East, Africa, the Americas, and even Central Asia. Agriculture involved settling down, which might not have been attractive to some hunting and gathering societies that treasured their capacity to move around. When agriculture was introduced, it brought massive changes in the human experience. Agriculture involves more work, particularly for men, than hunting and gathering. Thus, it redefined and increased the work expectations of human society. Agriculture also redefined gender relations. In most hunting and gathering societies, men did the hunting and women did the gathering. But because both groups contributed to the food supply, women usually had some influence in society. In agricultural societies, however, patriarchal systems predominated. The most obvious reason for the increase in male dominance was that agriculture both permitted and required an expansion of the birth rate. Men increasingly assumed the role of principal cultivator of the crucial food crops, resulting in the development of patriarchal societies. In hunting and gathering societies, children had few functions until they reached their early teens. In agricultural societies, childhood and work became more closely associated, and the idea of obedience tended to follow this shift. Now, the advent of agriculture raises interesting questions about human progress. Despite what many of us has learned in grade school, the adoption of agriculture had a number of drawbacks. In some cases, these drawbacks affected some groups' willingness to adopt agriculture. The first drawback is the introduction of new kinds of inequality, particularly between men and women. The second is that agriculture allowed people to settle down into clustered communities, which exposed the inhabitants to increased incidences of epidemic disease. The third is that agricultural societies altered the local environment in a way that hunting and gathering societies did not do, to the extent of damaging and even destroying a regional environment and the communities that existed there. The advantages of agriculture, however, allowed it to spread. One not entirely frivolous theory to explain this spread is that agriculture allowed the growth of products that could be fermented to create alcohol. More systematically, agriculture significantly improved food supplies, which in turn allowed families to have more children and resulted in population expansion. These conditions prevailed for a long time between about 9000 BCE until 300 to 400 years ago. Now, agricultural economies were constrained by limitations in the amount of food that a given worker could generate. Even the most advanced agricultural economies required about 80% of the population to be engaged primarily in agriculture, which limited the amount of taxation that could be levied and limited the size of cities to no more than 20% of the population. A crucial feature to remember about agricultural societies in general. Agricultural societies also generated cultural emphases, especially by encouraging new attention to the spring season and to divine forces responsible for creation. The crucial features of agriculture were its role in population increase and its capacity to generate discernible surpluses, which freed at least some people to do some things, such as manufacturing pottery. As we will see in the next lecture, manufacturing could lead to yet additional developments in the human experience, including the emergence of cities and advancements in other areas of technology.